September 1940. The sun hung low over Winter Ridge, casting long shadows across the valley that stretched below, like a promise kept. Samuel Bridger sat in his chair on the wide porch, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold an hour past. At 88, his back still held straight, his shoulders still squared against whatever the world might throw. But his hands showed the truth. Weathered, scarred, the hands of a man who had built something, lost something, and built it again. His grandson Marcus stood at the porch rail, staring down at the paper in his hands. 18 years old, tall like his grandfather, with the same dark hair and blue eyes that had once looked out from a younger face. The draft notice lay between them on the table like an accusation nobody wanted to make. Eleanor appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with fresh coffee and 2 cups. 78 now. Her auburn hair turned silver, but her green eyes still held that fierce intelligence Samuel had fallen in love with 55 years ago. She set the tray down without a word, touched Samuel's shoulder once, and disappeared back into the house. After more than half a century together, they knew when to give each other space. Marcus folded the paper carefully, tucked it into his shirt pocket. His jaw worked like he was chewing words too big to swallow. Samuel knew that look. He had worn it himself once, standing in a different place, facing a different kind of war. "Sit down, son." The boy sat, not because he had to, but because something in his grandfather's voice told him this moment mattered. Samuel took a slow breath, let it out through his nose. The valley spread before them, unchanged and unchanging. The timber stands on the north ridge. The mill by the river, its water wheel turning steady as a heartbeat. The small cabins where workers and their families lived good lives, honest lives. Everything his father had built, everything Samuel had nearly destroyed, everything Eleanor had helped him save. "Before you go," Samuel said, "I need to tell you about the hardest choice I ever made." Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening. "Your grandmother and I, you know we've been married 55 years. You know we built this valley together, raised your father here, watched him raise you. What you don't know is how it started, and why it almost ended before it began." The wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of sawdust and clean water. Samuel closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he was no longer seeing 1940. He was seeing 1885. Denver, a younger man in a fine suit, standing in a room full of vultures dressed as friends. "I was 32 years old," Samuel said. "I owned everything you see in this valley. Winter House was mine, the timber company, the land, more money than most men see in 10 lifetimes. And I was the loneliest man in Colorado territory." He paused, watching Marcus's face. The boy was listening hard now, trying to understand where this story was going. "I had 3 secrets when I married your grandmother," Samuel continued. "The first one almost broke us. The second one saved us. The third," he smiled a thin, sad curve of his mouth. "The third one I didn't discover until 30 years later, and by then it didn't matter anymore." Marcus shifted in his chair. "What were the secrets of Grandpa Bartow?" "That's the story, son, and you need to hear all of it before you make your choice about that paper in your pocket. Because what I learned 55 years ago is the same thing you need to learn now. The difference between running away from fear and running toward truth." Samuel picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down again. Eleanor would bring more when she sensed the story had gone far enough. She always knew. "May 1885, he began. "Denver, Colorado. Let me tell you about the man I was before I met your grandmother, and the man I became because of her." The valley stretched quiet below them, holding its breath, waiting for the story that had shaped it. Marcus settled deeper into his chair, and Samuel Bridger, patriarch of Winter Ridge, began to tell the truth about how everything had started with a lie. Denver society in 1885 smelled of imported perfume and rotting ambition. Samuel stood at the edge of Governor Harrison's spring reception, nursing a glass of whiskey he had no intention of drinking, watching the parade of peacocks circle the room. Men in tailored suits that cost more than a working man's yearly wage. Women in silk gowns that whispered secrets with every movement. All of them looking at him. All of them seeing the same thing. Money. Not Samuel Bridger, the man who rose at dawn to walk his timber stands. Not Samuel, who could notch a tree as clean as any man in his crew. Not Samuel, who lay awake nights worrying about watershed management and sustainable harvest rates. They saw Bridger Timber Company. They saw Winter Ridge. They saw gold. Mr. Bridger, a woman appeared at his elbow, all calculated curves and practiced smile. Sarah something, daughter of a railroad investor. 3 months ago, she would not have given him a second glance. Now her father was pushing her forward like a chess piece on a board Samuel had no interest in playing. I was hoping we might discuss your thoughts on the new rail extension into the high country. She did not care about rail extensions. She cared about the three-story lodge at Winter Ridge and the quarterly dividends that could keep her in Paris gowns for the rest of her life. I have no thoughts worth sharing, Miss Johnson. Samuel set his glass on a passing tray untouched. If you'll excuse me. He moved through the crowd, feeling their eyes track him like wolves following wounded prey. How many women had his Aunt Margaret paraded in front of him this season? 6, 7, all beautiful, all accomplished, and all seeing right through him to the timber deeds and bank accounts underneath. Margaret herself materialized from a cluster of matrons, her gray eyes sharp as flint. 53 years old, Robert Bridger's younger sister and the only family Samuel had left. She had opinions about everything, and she never kept them to herself. Samuel, not a greeting, an accusation. You were rooted to Sarah Johnson. Her father controls 40% of the Denver and Rio Grande stock. I was honest with Sarah Johnson. There's a difference. Margaret's mouth compressed into a line thin enough to cut paper. You're 32 years old. You've been running that company alone for 7 years. The board is getting restless. They want stability. They want to see you settled with an appropriate wife. Appropriate. The word tasted like copper in his mouth. Appropriate meant wealthy, connected, malleable. Everything Samuel had learned to hate about Denver society in the years since his father died. The board can want what they like. I'll marry when I'm ready. And when will that be? Margaret's voice dropped sharp and urgent. When you've driven away every suitable woman in the territory, when the company stock drops because investors think you're unstable. Your father built Bridger Timber from nothing, Samuel. Don't let sentiment destroy his legacy. Sentiment, as if wanting something real, something true, was a weakness to be excised like rot from timber. Samuel looked at his aunt, this woman who had helped raise him after his mother died, who had stood beside his father through every crisis, who now sat on the company board and wielded influence like a blade. She meant well, he knew that, but she had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted for yourself instead of your portfolio. I need air. He left before she could object, moving through the press of bodies toward the terrace doors. Outside, the mountain air hit his lungs clean and cold. Denver spread below the mansion, a sprawl of brick and ambition, trying to pretend it was as civilized as Boston or New York. Beyond the city, the foothills rose dark against the evening sky. The real Colorado, the honest country where a man's word still meant something and work paid in satisfaction as much as gold. Samuel gripped the terrace rail, knuckles white. 7 years. 7 years since his father's heart had given out during a winter storm, leaving Samuel with an empire he never asked for and responsibilities that sat on his shoulders like a yoke built for a different man. 7 years of board meetings and social functions, and women who looked at him and saw opportunity instead of a person. He was so tired of being alone in crowds. A plan formed in his mind, reckless, probably stupid, but the kind of stupid that felt necessary, like cauterizing a wound before infection could set in. Tomorrow he would leave Denver, not as Samuel Bridger, timber baron, as Sam, a mountain man with worn clothes and an honest trade. He would go down into the mining camps and small towns where people did not read the financial pages, where a man was measured by his handshake and the straightness of his word, and he would find someone real, someone who could see him. The decision settled in his chest like a key turning in a lock. Wrong maybe, manipulative certainly, but he was 32 years old and drowning in silk and superficiality, and he needed to know if anyone in this territory could want Samuel Bridger the man before they learned about Samuel Bridger the fortune. He would test them, find a woman who accepted him poor, and discover if honesty could grow from deception. The logic was broken, he knew. But desperation makes philosophers of fools, and Samuel was desperate enough to try. Back inside, Margaret had cornered Harrison Cole, the company's biggest investor, no doubt lobbying for another attempt at matchmaking. Samuel slipped past them, out the main doors, down the steps to where his carriage waited. His driver straightened when he saw him. Home, sir? No. Samuel stripped off his evening coat, loosened his collar. Already he felt lighter. Take me to the warehouse. I need to change clothes. The driver's eyebrows rose, but he asked no questions. Good man, knew when to keep his mouth shut. By midnight, as Samuel Bridger had disappeared from Denver society, in his place, a mountain man named Sam rode a serviceable horse up into the foothills, wearing canvas trousers and a worn leather coat, carrying nothing that would mark him as anything more than a man looking for honest work and a better life. 2 weeks later, he found Pine Ridge Mining Camp and Eleanor Hayes. Sully, Pine Ridge clung to the eastern slope like a scab that refused to heal. 40 wooden buildings, 60 canvas tents, a trading post, a saloon, a justice of the peace who doubled as the dentist when drink made men brave enough to sit in his chair. The creek that gave the camp its name ran thin and brown with tailings from played-out claims upstream. Men moved through the muddy street with the shuffling gait of those who had bet everything on hope and lost. Samuel had been watching for 3 days before he saw her. Eleanor Hayes came into the trading post just after dawn on a Thursday morning, carrying an empty flour sack and a basket that had seen better years. 23, maybe 24. Auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid. Green eyes that looked at the world with a mix of wariness and determination. She wore a brown dress that had been mended more times than Samuel could count, and when she set her basket on the counter, her hands showed calluses from real work. Samuel pretended to examine a display of mining tools while he listened. Morning, Miss Hayes. The trading post owner, a thick man named Hollis, had the careful voice of someone dealing with a customer who counted every penny twice. What can I get you today? 5 pounds of flour, 2 of salt, ½ pound of coffee if you've got yesterday's that you're looking to move. Got some from Tuesday, 20 cents a pound. 15. Now, Miss Hayes, I can't. 15, Mr. Hollis. That coffee's been sitting 3 days in this heat. Another day and it'll taste like boot leather. I'm doing you a favor taking it off your hands. A pause, then Hollis sighed. 15, but don't go telling folks I'm running a charity. Wouldn't dream of it. Eleanor counted out coins from a small leather pouch, her lips moving silently as she tallied the math. When Hollis brought her goods, she hefted the flour sack to check the weight. Her eyes narrowed. This isn't 5 pounds. Sure it is. Just checked the scale this morning. Eleanor set the sack on the counter with more force than necessary. Check it again. Hollis's face colored, but he pulled out his scale. When the flour settled, it read 4 pounds, 3 ounces. He muttered something under his breath and scooped more flour into the sack without meeting Eleanor's eyes. Appreciate your honesty, Mr. Hollis. Eleanor's voice held no triumph, just tired satisfaction. She loaded her purchases into her basket, turned, and nearly walked into Samuel. Pardon me, miss. She stepped aside without really looking at him, her mind already on the next task, the next problem, the next small battle to keep her family fed. Samuel watched her go. Watched how she moved through the street with her head up despite the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Watched how she ignored the appreciative looks from miners and the pitying glances from the few respectable women in camp. Everything about Eleanor Hayes said strength. Not the kind that came from privilege or protection, but the kind forged in the fire of necessity. The kind that bent but did not break. Over the next week, Samuel learned her story through careful questions and patient listening. Thomas Hayes, her father, 48 years old with lungs ruined by mine dust and debts that grew faster than hope. William, 15, trying to work a claim that had been dry for 2 years. Grace, 12, who should have been in school, but instead helped her sister keep a family from falling apart. And Eleanor, the spine of it all, the one who held them together through sheer refusal to let go. Samuel knew what he was about to do was wrong, knew it in his bones, but he had come this far, and something about Eleanor Hayes made him want to be the man he pretended to be instead of the one he really was. On a Tuesday evening, as storm clouds gathered over the peaks, Samuel rode up to the Hayes cabin. It sat half a mile from town, a rough log structure with a sagging roof and windows covered in oiled paper. Smoke struggled out of the chimney. In the yard, a mule stood hip-shot and exhausted, and a small garden plot showed more rocks than vegetables. Samuel dismounted, tied his horse to the porch rail, and knocked. The door opened after a long moment. Thomas Hayes stood there with an old rifle in his hands and death in his eyes. Not the death that comes quick. The slow kind, the kind that takes a man piece by piece while his family watches. Help you, I enter him. Name's Sam Bridger. I've been working timber up north. Heard you folks might be in need of help. Thomas's laugh turned into a cough that bent him double. When he straightened, there was blood on his handkerchief. Help, that's a kind word for it. May I come in? Thomas stepped back, and Samuel entered a world that smelled of wood smoke and sickness and quiet desperation. Eleanor stood by the cold stove, one hand on the back of a chair, her eyes sharp and measuring. William watched from the ladder to the loft, all sharp angles and adolescent suspicion. Grace huddled in the corner with a doll made from rags and hope. Samuel took off his hat, stood in the center of the room. Let them see him, a man in worn clothes with work-roughened hands. Not rich, not poor, just a man making his way in hard country. I'll say it plain, Mr. Hayes. I know about your debt. I know the bank in Denver is pressing hard. And I know you've got about 30 days before they take everything you own. Thomas's face went gray. Eleanor's hand tightened on the chair back until her knuckles showed white. I've got land higher in the mountains, Samuel continued. I work timber on a small scale, sell to mills. It's steady work, not rich, but enough to live on. I need a partner, someone strong, someone who won't break when winter comes hard. He turned to Eleanor, then met her eyes directly. I've watched you in town, Miss Hayes. Watched you fight for fair weight and carry loads that would break most men. Watched you hold your family together when everything was pushing to tear you apart. That's the kind of strength I need. The cabin was so quiet, Samuel could hear the wind starting to rise outside. I'll pay $500 toward your debt, he said to Thomas. Enough to keep the bank from taking your home. I'll send food and wood to see your family through winter. In return, Eleanor becomes my wife. Grace made a small sound. William came down the ladder, fists clenched. Thomas looked at Samuel like he was trying to read a book written in a foreign language. Eleanor said nothing, just watched him with those green eyes that saw too much and forgave too little. I'm not asking for a servant, Samuel said, speaking to her now. I'm asking for a partner. Someone to stand beside me when storms come. Someone who knows the value of honest work and keeps her word. That's all. That's everything. Why? Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. Why would a man like you make an offer like that unless there's something wrong with him? Fair question. Samuel had an answer prepared, one that was true enough to pass inspection and false enough to hide what mattered. I've been alone too long. Had a wife once, lost her to the mountains. Been 7 years. Time to try again. But I learned my lesson. I need someone who already knows how hard the country can be. Someone who won't expect silk when all I can offer is strong walls and steady meals. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then looked at Eleanor. The conversation that passed between them needed no words. Daughter, father, the weight of love and duty and impossible choices. I need to think, Eleanor said finally. This isn't a decision to make with a stranger at my door and night coming on. Fair enough. Samuel set his hat back on his head. I'll be at the trading post for the next 2 days. You know where to find me if you've got an answer. He walked to the door, then turned back. One more thing. I won't force anyone. If you decide yes, it's your choice and yours alone. If you decide no, I'll respect it and ride on. But understand this, I keep my word. Every promise I make here tonight, I'll honor. That's the kind of man I am. Then he stepped out into the rising wind and rode back toward town, knowing he had just told the biggest truth and the biggest lie of his life in the same breath. Behind him in the small cabin, Eleanor Hayes stood at the window and watched him go. Something was wrong about that man. The horse was too good. The saddle, though worn, showed quality workmanship, and his hands, for all their calluses, had the clean nails of someone who washed carefully, not the perpetual grime of hard country living. But her father was dying. Her brother was too young. Her sister would end up in an orphanage or worse, and Sam Bridger, whoever he really was, had just offered them survival wrapped in a wedding vow. Eleanor closed her eyes and felt the weight of being 23 years old and responsible for everyone she loved. Then she opened them again and began to plan. Dawn came cold and clear over Pine Ridge. Eleanor stood in the small garden behind the cabin, dirt under her nails and desperation in her chest. She had not slept, could not sleep, while her mind chased itself in circles, looking for options that did not exist. Inside, Thomas coughed like his lungs were tearing themselves apart. William had ridden up to the claim at first light, hoping against hope for color in the pan, but Eleanor knew what he would find. Nothing. The same nothing they had found for 6 months. The mountain had given up its gold and moved on, leaving them to starve on its bones. Ellie, Grace appeared in the doorway, her thin face worried. "Pa's asking for you." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and went inside. Thomas sat at the rough table, bent over like an old man, though he was not yet 50. The morning light through the window made him look translucent, already halfway to ghost. "Sit down, girl." Eleanor sat. "I failed you," Thomas said without preamble. "Failed your mother before she died. Failed Will and Grace. Most of all, failed you. No less let me say it." He met her eyes, his own wet with tears he was too proud to let fall. "That man who came last night, Bridger, I think he's your only chance. My debts are going to eat this family alive. The bank won't wait. They can't wait. They've got stockholders breathing down their necks, same as I've got them breathing down mine. 30 days and we're done." Eleanor's throat closed. She knew. She had always known, but hearing it said out loud made it real in a way that kept her awake nights. "I don't want to be sold like livestock." "I know, but wanting and getting aren't the same thing in this world. You taught me that when you were 14 and took over running this house after your mother passed. You're stronger than I ever was, Ellie." In Bridger, he saw that. Whatever he is, whatever he's hiding, he saw the truth of you. The truth of her. Eleanor looked down at her work-worn hands and wondered what truth anyone could see in a woman ground down by circumstance and necessity. That morning, she walked into town. The trading post was crowded with men buying supplies, and Eleanor had to wait while Hollis dealt with them one by one. She used the time to listen. Miners had opinions about everything, and they shared them freely when they thought no women were listening. "That Bridger fellow been hanging around 3 weeks now," one said, "asking questions, watching folks. Saw him talking to Bill Morrison from the freight company," another added. Morrison said Bridger was asking about transport costs to Denver, specific like, not the kind of questions a small-time timberman asks. "He pays in gold coin," Hollis said from behind the counter. "Not dust, not scrip, actual coin. You know what that means? Means he's got a stake somewhere or he's running from something." Eleanor filed the information away. When the men finally cleared out, she approached Hollis directly. "That man who's been in town, Bridger, what do you know about him?" Hollis scratched his jaw. "Not much. Keeps to himself mostly. But I'll tell you something strange. Last week he bought medical supplies. Good ones. Laudanum carbolic acid clean bandages. Not the kind of stuff you buy for a scraped knuckle. And he paid $30 cash without blinking. $30. A month's wage for most miners. Paid without hesitation for medicine that suggested someone was badly hurt or chronically ill. Eleanor added it to the growing pile of things that did not match the story Sam Bridger was selling. She found him 2 hours later sitting on the steps of the boarding house where he had taken a room. He stood when he saw her, not in the obsequious way of men who thought women fragile, but in the respectful way of equals meeting. "Miss Hayes, I have questions." "I'd expect nothing less." They walked to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to scrub and stone. The mountains rose above them, indifferent to human drama, holding their secrets close. "You're not what you seem," Eleanor said. "Not an accusation, a statement of fact." Samuel looked at her steadily. "No man is entirely what he seems. We all wear masks to some degree." "Is Sam Bridger even your real name?" "It's the name my father gave me, the name I've carried all my life. So yes, it's real." "But you're hiding something." "Yes." The honesty of it shocked her. She had expected denial, justification, the careful dance of lies that men told when they were caught. Instead, he just stood there and admitted it. "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't." Samuel turned to face her fully. "You should be suspicious. You should ask hard questions. You should protect yourself and your family. But here's what I'll tell you true. I have land in the high country. I have steady work. I can pay your father's debts and keep your family fed. Those aren't lies. What I am hiding is mine to carry, and when the time is right, I'll tell you. Until then, you have to decide if survival is worth marrying a man with secrets." Eleanor looked up at the mountains. Somewhere up there, Sam Bridger had a life waiting, a home, a future. And all she had was a dying father, a brother too young to be a man, and a sister who deserved better than Pine Ridge could offer. I need to think, she said. Take the time you need, but know that I meant what I said. The choice is yours. I won't force it. And if you say no, your father keeps the $500 anyway. That's my promise. He walked away, then leaving her standing alone with impossible choices and a heart that felt like it was being torn in half. The men from Denver arrived on horseback at noon 3 days later. Two of them, clean suits despite the dust of the road, polished boots that had never seen a mine shaft, leather satchels that held papers more dangerous than any weapon. Thomas saw them first, went white, and reached for the rifle. Eleanor stopped him with a hand on his arm. No, Pa, that won't help. The men dismounted, tied their horses, approached the cabin with the confidence of those who held all the cards. The taller one pulled papers from his satchel. Thomas Hayes. That's me. We represent First National Bank of Denver. You are 90 days past due on a debt of $847. This is formal notice. You have 30 days to make full payment or we will seize this property, all contents, and pursue legal action for any remaining balance. Thomas's mouth worked, but no sound came out. Do you understand the terms? The banker's voice was neither cruel nor kind, just businesslike, efficient, the voice of a machine grinding through its inevitable process. I understand. Good. The tall banker handed over the papers. 30 days, Mr. Hayes. After that, the law gives us the right to take everything, the cabin, the claim, the mule, even personal possessions to satisfy the debt. Your children will be remanded to territorial custody if no family can take them. They rode away as efficiently as they had come, leaving behind a silence so complete it hurt. Thomas crumpled into his chair. William appeared from the mine, took one look at his father's face and understood. Grace started crying silently, the way children cry when they have learned that making noise changes nothing. Eleanor stood in the doorway and felt something inside her calcify into diamond hardness. Not desperation anymore. Decision. That night, after the others had gone to bed, she sat at the table with a stub of candle and thought about choices. Real choices, not the illusion of them. She was 23 years old enough to know that the world did not care about fair, old enough to understand that sometimes survival meant doing things that broke your heart. Sam Bridger was hiding something. She knew that with certainty. But he had also offered a way out, a way to keep her family together and fed, a way to save her father's last shred of dignity. And something in the way he looked at her suggested he saw not a burden to be borne, but a partner to be valued. Was that enough to marry a stranger? It had to be, because the alternative was watching her father die in debtor's prison, her brother turned into a bitter old man at 20, and her sister sold to whatever family would take her. Eleanor closed the borrowed book she had been pretending to read, made her choice, and waited for morning to come so she could tell Sam Bridger that she would be his wife. Dawn broke clear and cold over Pine Ridge. Samuel stood in the yard of the boarding house loading his horse in a small wagon he had rented from the freight company. Flour, salt, coffee, dried meat, blankets, everything a family would need to survive until spring. $500 in gold certificates waited in an envelope in his pocket. He did not know if Eleanor would come, did not know if she would accept his offer or send him away with the righteous fury he probably deserved. But he had made his preparations anyway because that was what a man did. He kept his word whether it benefited him or not. Footsteps on the dirt road made him turn. Eleanor walked toward him with her back straight and her chin up, wearing the same brown dress and carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Everything she owned, probably. Everything she was willing to take into an unknown future with a man she did not trust. She stopped 3 feet away, met his eyes. I'll marry you. Samuel felt something in his chest ease and tighten at the same time. Relief and guilt tangled together in a knot he could not name. You're sure? No, but I'm certain I have no better choice. Honest, even now with everything on the line, she refused to pretend. Samuel respected that more than he could say. Then we'll do this right. He pulled the envelope from his pocket, held it out. Give this to your father. Tell him the debt is paid. I'll send a teamster back from the high country with supplies. Your family will be taken care of. Eleanor took the envelope without opening it. If you're lying to me, if you hurt them, I'll find a way to make you regret it. I know, and he did know. This woman would claw her way out of hell itself to protect the people she loved. It was one of the things that made her exactly what he needed, what he wanted, what he had no right to claim through deception. The justice of the peace opens at 9, Samuel said. We can be married by 10 and on the road by noon. That fast, unless you want a church wedding and a celebration, we both know neither of us wants. Eleanor's mouth quirked in something that was not quite a smile. No, fast is better, less time to think about what I'm doing. They married in a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. The justice of the peace read the words with the enthusiasm of a man who had performed the ceremony 500 times and would perform it 500 more. 2 witnesses, 5 minutes. A marriage certificate signed in ink that would not fade. Samuel slipped a plain gold band on Eleanor's finger. Not expensive, not flashy, just solid and true. I'll try to be a good husband, he said. I'll try not to kill you when I find out what you're hiding. Eleanor's voice was dry, but Samuel saw the fear underneath. The vulnerability she was trying desperately not to show. By noon, they were loading the wagon. Thomas stood in the cabin doorway with William and Grace flanking him like small sentinels. The gold certificates had been counted and verified. The teamster Samuel hired was already hitching his wagon for the return trip with supplies. Eleanor hugged Grace until the girl squeaked, gripped William's shoulder with fierce pride, stood before her father and said nothing because there were no words big enough to hold what they both felt. You're stronger than you know, girl, Thomas said, his voice breaking. Stronger than I ever was. Remember that. Then Eleanor climbed onto the wagon seat beside Samuel, and they rolled out of Pine Ridge without looking back. Because looking back might shatter the brittle courage holding her together. The trail climbed steadily into the foothills. Pine trees closed in around them, tall and dark. The air grew thin and cold. Samuel drove the wagon with easy competence, his hands steady on the reins, his eyes always moving, checking the road, the sky, the horses. Eleanor sat beside him in silence, watching everything. His hands, clean nails despite the calluses. The reins, quality leather supple and well-maintained. His coat, worn yes, but the stitching was professional work, not home repair. His boots, solid construction, good leather, the kind that lasted years with proper care. Every detail whispered that Sam Bridger was not what he claimed to be. They made camp the first night beside a narrow creek. Samuel built a fire with the efficiency of long practice, no wasted motion, no fumbling. He shared out dried beef hardtack coffee that tasted better than it had any right to. Laid out bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire without making a show of it. Eleanor appreciated that. This marriage was business, at least for now. No need to pretend otherwise. How long have you lived in the high country? She asked as they sat watching the fire burn down. 7 years. Came after I needed to leave Denver. Running from something, running towards something. Samuel poked at the coals with a stick. There's a difference. Is there? He looked at her across the flames, and for just a moment, Eleanor saw something in his face that looked like genuine pain, like regret, like the loneliness of a man who had made choices he could not unmake. I hope so, he said quietly, because if there's not, then I'm just a coward with good intentions. They slept under stars that burned cold and bright in a sky so clear it hurt. Eleanor lay awake for hours, listening to the horses move the fire settle Samuel's steady breathing on the other side of the dying flames. She had married a stranger, tied her life to a man she did not know or trust, and tomorrow they would climb higher into mountains that cared nothing for human hope or fear. But she was alive. Her family was alive, and sometimes that had to be enough. The second day brought them higher. The trail narrowed, forcing Samuel to walk beside the horses on steep sections, his hand on their bridles, talking to them in low, steady tones. Eleanor watched him work and revised her estimation upward again. This was not a man who had learned horses casually. This was expert handling, the kind that came from years of working with good stock. They passed a section where telephone wire ran along the ridge. Eleanor's breath caught. Telephone service this far out meant money. Serious money. Companies did not string wire into wilderness for small operations. Who put in the telephone? She asked. Samuel did not look at her. My timber operation. Must be some operation. It's adequate. Adequate. Eleanor stored the word away with all the others that did not quite fit the story Samuel was telling. That evening they camped at a narrow pass between two walls of stone. Storm clouds gathered over the peaks, painting the western sky in shades of bruise and blood. Samuel stood at the edge of camp, staring at something Eleanor could not see. She came to stand beside him. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, just—" He paused, weighing words. "The next hill changes everything. I need you to know that. When we crest that rise, you're going to see something that will make you question every choice you have made. And when you do, I need you to remember I gave you an option." "What option?" "When we get there, if you can't accept what you see, I'll take you back down. No questions. Your family keeps the money. You keep your freedom. That's my promise." Eleanor's heart started beating faster. "What am I going to see?" "Truth." Samuel finally turned to look at her, and his blue eyes held fear. Real fear. Not of storm or mountain or wild animal, but of losing something that mattered. "The truth I should have told you from the beginning, but was too cowardly to admit." They stood in the fading light while thunder rumbled in the distance. Eleanor wanted to demand answers, but something in Samuel's face stopped her. This was a confession waiting to be made. Pushing now would only make him retreat. "All right," she said, "show me." They broke camp at dawn. The trail climbed one last steep section, then leveled out and bent around a cluster of twisted pines. Samuel pulled the horses to a stop, sat there with the reins in his hands, not moving, not speaking. "Ready." His voice was barely audible over the wind, as I'll ever be. He clicked to the horses. The wagon rolled forward, around the bend, through the trees, and the world opened up. Below them lay a hidden valley cut by steep slopes and dark forest. A river cut through the center, silver in the morning light. Meadows glowed green despite the approaching winter. The valley was beautiful, untouched. The kind of country that made a person believe in second chances. But that was not what stopped Eleanor's breath in her throat. In the center of the valley stood a great lodge built of massive logs and rough-cut stone. 3 stories tall, broad porches wrapped around it. Tall windows caught the rising sun. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys. Around it spread barns and fences and worker cabins laid out in neat, orderly rows. A sawmill sat on the river, its water wheel already turning the sound of industry drifting up on the morning air. This was not a small timber operation. This was an empire. Eleanor's hands clenched on the wagon seat until her knuckles went white. Her breath came shallow and fast. She turned to look at Samuel and saw him watching her with that same fear in his eyes. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of losing something he had not honestly earned. "Your name is Sam Bridger," she said, her voice flat and hard. "Samuel Bridger, yes. And this is your— shown in what your kingdom?" "My father's legacy, my responsibility, Winter Ridge Valley. The lodge is called Winter House." Eleanor looked back at the valley, at the lodge that was bigger than any building in Pine Ridge, at the clear evidence of wealth and power and everything Sam Bridger had pretended not to have. "You lied. I deceived. There's a difference." "Is there?" She threw his own words back at him with bitter precision. Samuel flinched but did not look away. "My full name is Samuel Bridger. My father was Robert Bridger. He founded Bridger Timber Company 30 years ago. Built this valley, the lodge, everything you see. When he died 7 years ago, it passed to me, along with money, responsibility, and 1,000 people in Denver who see me as nothing more than a bank account with legs. So you decided to trick some desperate mountain girl instead. I decided to find someone who could see Samuel Bridger the man before they learned about Samuel Bridger the fortune." His voice broke slightly. "I needed to know if anyone in this territory could want me for myself. And yes, I chose poorly. Yes, I manipulated you. Yes, I used your desperation against you. I'm not proud of it, but I'm asking you to understand why I did it before you condemn me for how I did it." Eleanor's chest hurt. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. She had married this man thinking he was one thing and discovered he was something else entirely. Had she been bought, traded? Was she just another acquisition for a wealthy man's collection? "You could have had anyone," she said. "Any woman in Colorado. Why me?" "Because when I watched you fight with Hollis about the weight of that flour sack, you didn't back down. You demanded honesty even when it cost you. When I saw you carrying loads that should have broken you, you carried them anyway because your family needed it. You held your world together with nothing but will and courage. That's what I need. Not a pretty face or social connections. A partner. Someone who will stand with me when everyone else wants to tear me apart for their own gain. The wind moved through the valley carrying the scent of pine and sawdust and the river's cold clarity. Eleanor sat there feeling the weight of impossible choices pressed down on her again. She could demand he take her back to Pine Ridge, prove she was not the kind of woman who could be bought. But then what? Her family still faced ruin. Her father still died slowly. Grace still ended up God knew where. Or she could stay, build something here with a man who had lied to her but who was at least honest enough to admit it. A man who had wealth but seemed to understand its cost. A man who looked at her and saw strength instead of a burden. I didn't want you, Eleanor said, the words cutting like glass in her throat. I wanted survival. You bought me. At least be honest about that. Samuel's face went gray. You're right. That's exactly what I did, and I'll regret it every day for the rest of my life. The wagon creaked as the horses shifted their weight. Thunder rumbled in the distance, or maybe it was just her heart breaking with the sound of everything she had hoped for turning to ash. Take me down there, Eleanor said finally. Show me this empire you've built on lies. Then I'll decide if I'm staying or if you're taking me home. Samuel nodded once, picked up the reins, and the wagon began its descent into Winter Ridge Valley, where Eleanor Hayes would learn whether she had married a monster or just a desperately lonely man who had made a terrible choice for heartbreaking reasons. The lodge rose before them solid and permanent, a testament to wealth and power, and everything Eleanor had never dreamed of having. And as they rolled through the front gates, she felt the door to her old life close behind her with the finality of a tomb. The great doors of Winter House opened onto a world Eleanor had only read about in borrowed books. Polished floors stretched away into shadows. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, large enough to roast a whole pig. Heavy timber beams crossed the ceiling 30 feet above her head. Windows taller than a man let in light that seemed to come from a different sky than the one she had known in Pine Ridge. A woman appeared from a side hallway, gray hair pinned neat, wearing a clean apron over a dark dress. She was perhaps 55, with the kind of competent face that suggested nothing surprised her anymore. She stopped when she saw Eleanor, and something flickered in her eyes. Not judgment exactly, more like recognition of a problem she would have to solve. Mrs. Cooper, Samuel said, his voice formal in a way Eleanor had not heard before. This is my wife, Eleanor Bridger. Eleanor, this is Margaret Cooper, our housekeeper. She runs Winter House better than I ever could. Mrs. Cooper's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. Your wife, sir, the slightest emphasis on the word. We weren't expecting, that is, congratulations are in order. Thank you. Samuel stripped off his worn coat. Underneath his shirt was white and clean, the fabric quality Eleanor had not noticed before. Eleanor has had a long journey. Perhaps you could show her to her rooms and help her get settled. Her rooms, plural. Eleanor bit back a hysterical laugh. Mrs. Cooper nodded crisply. Of course, sir. This way, Mrs. Bridger. Eleanor followed the housekeeper up a wide staircase, her hand trailing on a banister smooth as glass. The second-floor hallway was lined with paintings, mountains and forests and rivers. The kind of art that cost more than her father's cabin was worth. Mrs. Cooper opened a door at the end of the hall and stood aside. Eleanor walked into a bedroom larger than the entire Hayes cabin. A four-poster bed dominated one wall covered in quilts that looked hand-stitched and beautiful. A wardrobe stood against another wall, its wood polished to a mirror shine. Windows overlooked the valley, offering a view that took her breath away. The washroom is through there, Mrs. Cooper pointed to another door. Hot water can be drawn from the pump. Towels in the cabinet. Dinner is at 6, though I can bring something up if you'd prefer to rest first. Eleanor turned slowly, taking it all in. Then she looked at the housekeeper. Where does Mr. Bridger sleep? Mrs. Cooper's face went carefully neutral. This room was meant to be shared, ma'am. The master bedroom. But Mr. Bridger hasn't used it in 7 years. Not since... She stopped, caught herself. Perhaps I've said too much. Since when? Eleanor pressed. That's Mr. Bridger's story to tell, ma'am, not mine. Mrs. Cooper moved toward the door, then paused. May I speak frankly? Please. This house has been waiting a long time for a mistress. The staff will be curious. Some may be skeptical. But we're good people who do good work. Give us a chance and we'll give you one in return. Then she was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in a room built for someone she was not wearing a dress that marked her as an imposter, feeling the weight of secrets she had not asked for pressing down like winter snow. She walked to the window. Below, Samuel stood in the yard talking to a tall man in work clothes. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see the change in him, the way he held himself, the authority in his gestures. This was not the worn mountain man who had knocked on her cabin door. This was the owner, the boss, the man who controlled everything she could see, and she had married him based on a lie. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool glass and wondered if she had made the biggest mistake of her life or the only choice that mattered. The next morning, Samuel found Eleanor in the kitchen before dawn. She wore the same brown dress from Pine Ridge, her hair in the same practical braid. Mrs. Cooper and the cook looked startled to find the new mistress in their domain, but Eleanor ignored their surprise. "I'd like to see the operation," she said to Samuel. "You said I should understand what this place is. Show me." Samuel studied her face, then nodded. "All right, but dress warm. It's cold in the timber stands." They walked through the valley as the sun climbed over the eastern peaks. Samuel showed her everything. The sawmill where massive logs were stripped of bark and cut into boards with mechanical precision. The worker housing where 65 men and their families lived in cabins that put her father's home to shame. The small schoolhouse where children learned reading and arithmetic. The supply depot, the tool shop, the stables with 20 horses, all of them looking well-fed and cared for. Eleanor asked questions, and Samuel answered them with a directness that surprised her. How many men worked here 65 full-time more in summer? What did he pay them? $2 a day above the standard wage. Why selective cutting instead of clear cutting the stands? Because sustainable yield meant his grandchildren would still have timber to harvest when other operations had turned their forests to wasteland. They stopped on a ridge overlooking the northern timber stands. Old-growth forests stretched away in every direction, trees that had been growing when the nation was young. Samuel pointed to markers on certain trees. "We take 1 tree in 10, he said. "Only the mature ones, and only when we can do it without damaging the canopy. My father taught me that land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. Take care of it, and it takes care of you. Rape it, and your children inherit dust." Eleanor looked at him. This man who had lied about being poor but told the truth about the land. This contradiction she had married. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was, and I failed him by letting fear turn me into a coward." "Fear of what?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "Fear of being alone. Fear that nobody would ever see past the money to the man underneath. Fear that I'd die rich and miserable, surrounded by people who wanted my fortune, but not my company." "So you lied to find honesty." "I told myself it was a test, that I needed to know who was real. But you're right, I lied. And I hurt you doing it. That's something I'm going to have to live with." They walked back to the house in silence. Eleanor thought about Pine Ridge, about the difference between $2 a day and $1.50, about the school that taught children instead of sending them into mines, about selective cutting that left forests standing instead of stripped hillsides that bled mud into creeks. Samuel Bridger was a liar, but he was also a man who treated his workers well and thought about tomorrow instead of only today. That had to count for something. At dinner that evening, served in a dining room with a table that could seat 20, Eleanor struggled with silverware she had never seen before. Samuel watched but said nothing. Did not help. Did not correct. Just let her figure it out on her own. Eleanor was not sure if that was respect or cruelty. "Tomorrow," Samuel said as dessert was cleared away, "I need to show you the books. You should know how the company operates. What we owe. What we own. A partner should understand the business." "A partner?" Eleanor set down her napkin. "Is that what I am? Because from where I sit, I'm a woman you bought to fill an empty house." Samuel flinched. "If that's all I wanted, I could have hired someone. I need someone who will tell me when I'm wrong. Someone who will stand beside me, not behind me. That's why I chose you. You chose me because I was desperate. I chose you because you're strong. There's a difference, Brown." Eleanor stood. "I'm going to bed, alone, in that beautiful room that was built for someone else. Tomorrow you can show me your books and pretend I'm your partner. But tonight I just want to be left alone with my regrets." She walked out and Samuel sat at the empty table surrounded by wealth and comfort and the aching loneliness he had thought marriage might cure. 3 days later, Eleanor discovered the portrait. She had been exploring the house, learning its rooms and corridors, finding her way through a place large enough to get lost in. The library stopped her cold, floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books, real books, hundreds of them, more than she had ever seen in one place. She was examining the titles when she noticed the portrait on the far wall covered with a black drape. Curiosity pulled her across the room. She lifted the cloth. The woman in the painting was beautiful. Dark hair, delicate features, pale skin, and eyes that looked sad, even frozen in oil and canvas. A small brass plate at the bottom read, "Anna Bridger, 1877 to 1878. "Ma'am," Mrs. Cooper's voice made Eleanor jump. The housekeeper stood in the doorway, her face tight with something that might have been concern or warning. "Mr. Bridger doesn't like that portrait displayed." "Who was she?" Mrs. Cooper came closer, her voice dropping. "His first wife. She died. It was tragic." "How did she die?" "I've said too much already." Mrs. Cooper reached for the drape, but Eleanor caught her wrist. "Please. If I'm living in her shadow, I need to know." The housekeeper hesitated, then sighed. She couldn't bear it here. Hated the isolation, the cold, the lack of society. She lasted 6 months, then she fell. From the ridge path, January 1878. Fell. That's what I said. Was it an accident? Mrs. Cooper pulled her wrist free gently. The sheriff ruled it an accident. But Anna had been unhappy, very unhappy. Some thought she jumped. Some thought she stopped, shook her head. Mr. Bridger found her at dawn. He hasn't been the same since. Eleanor looked back at the portrait, at the sad eyes and delicate features, at a woman who had been brought to Winter Ridge and could not survive it. Where is she buried? The ridge above the house. There's a stone. That evening, Eleanor climbed the ridge, found the grave marker easily. Simple granite, well maintained. Anna Bridger, beloved wife, 1857 to 1878. 21 years old when she died, younger than Eleanor was now. Eleanor stood there as the sun set, thinking about a girl from Boston who had married wealth and found prison, who had lasted 6 months before the mountains broke her, and she wondered if the same fate waited for her. "I didn't know you'd found it." Samuel's voice came from behind her. She had not heard him approach. "Mrs. Cooper told me." Of course she did. Samuel moved to stand beside her, looking down at the grave. Her name was Anna Morrison, from Boston. Educated, cultured, everything a man like me was supposed to want. My Aunt Margaret introduced us. Anna's father owned textile mills. It was a proper marriage between proper families. "Did you love her?" "I thought I did. Now I think I love the idea of her, the image of what our life could be." He paused. "She hated it here from the first day. Too isolated, too cold, too far from everything she knew. She begged me to move to Denver. I refused. The work was here. My father's legacy was here. I thought she'd adjust. I thought love would be enough. But it wasn't. No, we fought the night she died. She wanted to visit her family for Christmas. I said we were too busy. The mill was behind schedule. I couldn't leave. She ran out into a snowstorm. I thought she'd cool off and come back. But she went up to the ridge path. They found her at the bottom of the ravine the next morning." Eleanor heard the pain in his voice, the guilt that had lived there for 7 years. The sheriff said it was an accident, that she slipped on ice, but I knew. She was desperate enough to do anything to escape, and I was too blind to see it. "You think she jumped?" "I think I killed her." Samuel's voice cracked, not with my hands, but with my stubbornness, my arrogance, my refusal to see that she was drowning. I learned something that day, Eleanor. I learned that keeping someone against their will, even in a beautiful cage, is still a kind of murder. He turned to face her then, and his eyes held tears he was too proud to let fall. "That's why I told you at the pass. That's why I said I'd take you back if you couldn't accept what you saw. I won't make the same mistake twice. I won't trap you here. If you want to leave, I'll take you down tomorrow. No argument, no guilt. You'll have your freedom and your family will keep the money." Eleanor looked from the grave to the man beside it. Samuel Bridger had lied to her, yes, had manipulated her desperation, but he was also a man carrying guilt that would crush a weaker soul, a man who had learned a brutal lesson about the cost of selfishness. "I'm not Anna," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm not fragile or delicate or city-bred. I grew up in mining camps. I've worked since I was 12 years old. I don't break easy. I know. But I need honesty from you. Real honesty. No more secrets. No more lies by omission. If we're going to make this work, I need to know who you really are." Samuel nodded slowly. "I'll try. That's all I can promise. I'll try, Mautu." They walked back down the ridge together as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Behind them, Anna's grave stood silent, a monument to love that had not been enough and lessons learned too late. The carriage arrived 1 week later without warning. Eleanor was in the garden behind the house, trying to coax vegetables from soil that seemed too rich to need her help when Mrs. Cooper came running. "Ma'am, there's visitors. Important ones." Eleanor straightened dirt on her hands and dress. "Who?" "Miss Margaret Bridger and 2 men from the company board." The name hit Eleanor like cold water. Samuel's aunt, the woman who had arranged his first marriage, the one who sat on the board and controlled enough votes to make life difficult if she chose. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly aware of how she must look. A miner's daughter playing at being a lady. She lifted her chin. "I suppose I should meet them." In the great room, 3 people stood examining the space like inspectors cataloging defects. Margaret Bridger was tall and elegant, wearing a traveling suit that probably cost more than everything Eleanor owned. Gray hair pulled back in a severe style, eyes like winter ice. The 2 men with her wore fine suits and carried leather cases. One was perhaps 60 with silver hair and the smooth face of someone who had never done hard labor. The other was younger, maybe 40, with wire spectacles and the sharp look of a lawyer who enjoyed finding loopholes. Samuel stood near the fireplace, his face carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "Aunt Margaret," Samuel's voice was formal, "I wasn't expecting you." Clearly. Margaret's eyes found Eleanor traveled from her scuffed boots to her dirt-streaked apron to her wind-blown hair. "So, this is the surprise bride." Not a question. An indictment. "This is my wife, Eleanor Bridger." Samuel moved to stand beside Eleanor, a gesture of support that felt both protective and possessive. "Eleanor, my Aunt Margaret Bridger, and our board members Harrison Cole and James Pritchard." Eleanor met Margaret's gaze directly. "Ma'am." "How rustic." Margaret's smile had no warmth in it. "Samuel, did you truly marry without consulting the board, without any discussion of the implications for the company?" "The board has no say in my personal life." "Don't they?" Cole, the older man, stepped forward. His voice was smooth as oil. "Bridger Timber is negotiating contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Our investors expect certain standard. Stability, respectability, a family that reflects well on the company. My marriage is stable and respectable." "Is it?" Pritchard, the lawyer, opened his case and pulled out papers. "Your father's will contains specific provisions regarding marriage and company control. Any union that could endanger the company's stability can be challenged by board vote." Eleanor's stomach went cold. Samuel's face had gone pale. Margaret moved closer to Eleanor, examining her like livestock at auction. "Miss, what was it, Hayes from Pine Ridge Mining Camp? My dear, surely you understand that someone of your background is unsuitable for the wife of Bridger Timber's owner. Our investors expect a certain standard. Education, breeding, social connections." The words were polite. The meaning was clear. "You don't belong here." Eleanor felt heat rise in her face. Not shame, anger. "I understand that you are concerned about appearances, Miss Bridger, but I suspect Mr. Bridger's workers care more about fair wages and safe housing than whether his wife knows which fork to use at formal dinners." Margaret's eyes narrowed. Spoken like someone who has never attended a formal dinner. "You're right, I haven't. I've been too busy working to keep my family fed. But I learned how to read contracts, how to manage accounts, and how to spot when someone's trying to cheat me on weight or price. If that's not useful for a timber company, perhaps you need better board members." Pritchard cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bridger, we're not trying to insult you. We're trying to protect a company that employs hundreds of people and supports dozens of families. Your husband's personal choices affect all of them. Then you should be pleased he chose someone who understands what working families need instead of another Boston socialite who thinks workers are interchangeable parts. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Cole and Pritchard exchanged glances. Margaret's face had gone rigid with controlled fury. Samuel touched Eleanor's elbow gently. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No. Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. This needs to be addressed now. Samuel, we have a solution. There's a reception at the governor's mansion in Denver 2 weeks from now. All the territorial elite will attend. Investors, politicians, the people who matter. What does that have to do with anything? Bring your wife. Margaret's smile was cold and sharp. Let her attend. Let her prove she can hold her own in that world. If she succeeds, we'll accept the marriage. If she fails, she gestured to Pritchard. The board votes to dissolve the marriage on grounds of company endangerment. You can't dissolve a legal marriage. Pritchard adjusted his spectacles. We can challenge the marriage's validity. We can tie up your assets in litigation for years. We can make it very difficult for you to operate the company. He paused. Or your wife can attend one reception and prove she belongs. It's a reasonable request. Eleanor looked at Samuel, saw him weighing options, calculating odds. This was the world he lived in, where marriages were business decisions and love was measured in board votes. 2 weeks, Margaret said. The governor's reception. If Mrs. Bridger can prove she belongs, we'll accept her. If she can't, the board will act. She picked up her gloves from a side table. I trust you'll make the right decision. They left as efficiently as they had arrived, their carriage rolling away down the valley road. Samuel stood in the middle of the great room, looking like a man who had just taken a punch to the gut. Eleanor waited. Let him find the words. I won't do it, Samuel said finally. I won't put you through that. They'll tear you apart. Every mistake, every misstep, they'll use it against us. I'll fight them instead. Find other investors. Break Margaret's control. How long will that take? Months, maybe a year. And meanwhile, what happens to the 65 men working here? Their families, if the company falls apart while you're fighting your aunt, who suffers? Samuel had no answer. Eleanor moved to stand in front of him, looked up into his face. You chose me to save my family. Now I'm choosing this to save yours. Eleanor, you don't know what you're agreeing to. Denver society is vicious. They'll look for any weakness and exploit it without mercy. Then they're no different than mine foremen who short-weight the flour or claim bosses who pay in scrip instead of cash. I've dealt with predators before, Samuel. These ones just wear better clothes. This is different. Is it? Eleanor smiled without humor. You stood in my father's cabin and told me you needed someone strong, someone who wouldn't break under pressure. Were you lying then too, or do you actually believe it? Samuel closed his eyes. When he opened them, they held something that might have been awe or fear or both. You're really going to do this. We're going to do this together, because that's what partners do, isn't it? Stand with each other when the wolves circle. And Samuel Bridger, who had manipulated and lied and nearly destroyed everything trying to avoid being alone, felt something crack open in his chest. Something that might have been the first honest emotion he had felt in 7 years. All right, he said. We'll go to Denver. We'll face them together. Eleanor nodded once, then turned and walked out to find Mrs. Cooper. If she was going to war, she needed to learn the battlefield. The next 10 days passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Mrs. Cooper became Eleanor's unlikely ally, drilling her on formal etiquette with the precision of a drill sergeant. How to address politicians and their wives. What topics were safe for conversation and which were landmines? The difference between a salad fork and a fish fork and why it mattered, even though it was completely absurd. A seamstress came up from Denver, a small woman with pins in her mouth and opinions about everything. She measured Eleanor with professional efficiency, then disappeared into a spare room where her sewing machine whirred day and night. Nothing too fancy, Eleanor insisted. I'll trip on ruffles and look ridiculous in bows. The seamstress smiled around her pins. Trust me, dear, simple can be more striking than elaborate, especially when you're trying to prove you belong. Samuel spent hours with Eleanor teaching her the bones of the timber business, board feet and market prices, contract terms and profit margins, the names of key investors and what they cared about. Coal controls 40% of our capital, Samuel explained, pointing to figures in a ledger. He's the one who bought your father's debt note. That's how Margaret is applying pressure. If I can't pay him back immediately, he can force liquidation. How much do you owe him? $15,000. Eleanor's breath caught. A fortune. Multiple fortunes. More money than she could conceptualize. How did you come to owe him that much? Samuel's face tightened. When I paid your father's debt, I had to borrow from Cole to cover it without draining company operating funds. I thought I'd have time to pay it back gradually. But Margaret convinced him to demand immediate payment. She's using your family's debt as a weapon against us. The irony was not lost on Eleanor. Her father's debt, which Samuel had paid to save her family, was now threatening to destroy them both. The dress arrived 2 days before they were scheduled to leave for Denver. Forest green silk, the color of pine needles after rain. Simple lines that flowed instead of restricting. No ruffles, no excessive trim, just clean elegance that made Eleanor feel less like she was playing dress-up and more like she was arming for battle. She stood before the mirror in her room, barely recognizing the woman looking back. Mrs. Cooper had shown her how to pin her hair in a style that was formal, but not fussy. The dress fit perfectly, emphasizing her height and the strength in her shoulders instead of trying to hide it. You look every inch a lady, Mrs. Cooper said from the doorway, but more than that, you look like yourself. That's what matters. Eleanor turned the skirt swishing around her ankles. Will it be enough? I don't know, ma'am, but I know this. You've already survived more than most of those Denver women could imagine. Poverty, hunger, watching your father die slowly. You held your family together when everything tried to tear you apart. Whatever they throw at you tomorrow, it won't be worse than what you've already endured. Eleanor hoped that was true, but hope and certainty were different countries, and she was traveling into unknown territory. The night before they left, Samuel found her on the porch watching the stars emerge. He carried 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without speaking. They stood together in comfortable silence, a thing that had developed between them over the past weeks. Not quite trust, not yet friendship, but something approaching partnership. I'm sorry, Samuel said finally, for all of it, for lying, for putting you in this position, for making your life harder than it already was. Are you sorry enough to be honest from now on? Yes. Then stop apologizing and start helping me prepare for tomorrow. What else do I need to know about Margaret and the board? Samuel smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, and they spent the next 2 hours talking strategy like generals before a battle, which in many ways they were. Denver rose from the plains like an accusation built of brick and ambition. Eleanor watched it approach through the coach window, her stomach tight with nerves she refused to show. Beside her, Samuel sat in a fine suit that transformed him from mountain man to magnate. Another mask, another version of himself. The city was overwhelming. Wagons and riders choked the streets. Buildings leaned over sidewalks, blocking out the sky. People moved with purpose and speed, everyone rushing somewhere important. The air smelled of coal smoke and horse manure, and too many humans pressed too close together. Their hotel was grand in a way that made Winter House look almost modest. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, doormen in uniforms who probably cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe. The desk clerk took one look at Eleanor and Samuel, and his professional smile never wavered, but his eyes made calculations she could feel. In their room, Eleanor stood at the window looking down at the city that Margaret Bridger called home. This was the battlefield. These streets, these buildings, these people who measured worth in social connections and political influence. Having second thoughts, Samuel joined her at the window. Too late for that. We're here, we fight. That evening, they stood outside the ballroom doors. Music drifted through, elegant and cold. Through the crack, Eleanor could see women in gowns that probably cost as much as her father's cabin. Men in tailored suits talking politics and business with the casual ease of those who had never worried about their next meal. Samuel offered his arm. Eleanor took it, her hands steady despite the fear eating at her inside. Ready as I'll ever be. The doorman opened both doors wide, announced their names in a voice that carried across the ballroom like judgment. Mr. Samuel Bridger and Mrs. Eleanor Bridger. Every head turned. Conversations paused, and Eleanor stepped forward into the light. The ballroom was magnificent. Chandeliers blazed overhead. Mirrors on the walls doubled the crowd. A string quartet played in the corner. Women moved like flowers in silk and satin. Men stood in clusters, cigars and whiskey, power and influence made visible. Eleanor felt every eye on her dress, her hair, her posture, measuring, judging, finding her wanting. Samuel's hand covered hers on his arm. Steady, warm, a reminder that she was not alone in this. A group of men approached immediately. Investors, Eleanor guessed from the way they moved with casual confidence. They greeted Samuel by his first name, pumped his hand, and their eyes slid over Eleanor with the dismissive speed of those who had already determined she did not matter. Bridger, good to see you. We've been meaning to discuss the northern expansion. The railroad contracts are coming up for renewal. There's an opportunity in Wyoming we should explore. They talked over her, around her, through her. Eleanor stood silent, her training from Mrs. Cooper kicking in. Do not interrupt. Do not demand attention. Wait for an opening and take it decisively. A woman detached from a nearby group, all calculated curves and expensive perfume. She smiled at Eleanor with the warmth of a snake evaluating prey. Mrs. Bridger, how lovely to finally meet you. I'm Catherine Morrison. I heard you're from... She paused delicately. The mining country. How fascinating. I've never been that far from civilization. The word civilization hung in the air like an insult wrapped in silk. Pine Ridge, Eleanor said evenly. It's small but honest. People there value hard work over appearances. How quaint. Catherine's smile sharpened. I imagine Denver must seem overwhelming to you. So many people, so many rules of etiquette. It must be terribly confusing. Before Eleanor could respond, Margaret Bridger appeared like a ship of state cutting through lesser vessels. She wore deep red silk that made her look like blood, and money had a child. Her gray eyes found Eleanor and dismissed her in a single glance. Mrs. Bridger. Not Eleanor, a reminder that the title was all Margaret was willing to grant. I'm so pleased you could join us. Samuel, there are people you need to meet. Come. She guided Samuel away with the ease of long practice, leaving Eleanor standing alone in a sea of strangers. It was a power move, deliberate, designed to make Eleanor feel isolated and vulnerable. Eleanor lifted her chin and moved toward the refreshment table. If they wanted to play games, she would learn the rules. But as she crossed the ballroom, she felt the weight of judgment following her, heard the whispers that were not quite quiet enough. That's her. Samuel married a miner's daughter. Poor man, Margaret must be beside herself. I heard the girl can barely read. Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her face neutral. Let them whisper. Let them judge. She had come here to survive, not to make friends. At the refreshment table, a woman, perhaps 10 years older than Eleanor, smiled with what looked like genuine warmth. Mrs. Bridger, I'm Sarah Harrison, the governor's wife. Welcome to Denver. Eleanor studied her, carefully looking for the trap, but Sarah Harrison's brown eyes held only kindness and a hint of amusement. Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. Sarah, please. And may I say that dress is stunning. Simple elegance. So much better than all these ruffles and bows most women feel obligated to wear. I'm not really the ruffle type. I can see that. Sarah handed Eleanor a cup of punch. Don't let them intimidate you. These society women think sharp tongues make them powerful. But real power comes from knowing who you are and refusing to apologize for it. Before Eleanor could respond, Harrison Cole materialized beside them, the main investor, the man who held her father's debt note and Samuel's future in his hands. Mrs. Bridger, his smile was professional and empty. A pleasure to finally meet you. Samuel speaks highly of your strength. Does he, Eleanor kept her voice neutral. Indeed, tell me what's your view on territorial expansion. The railroad question is quite contentious these days. It was a test, Eleanor could feel it. He did not care about her opinion. He wanted to see if she would stumble, prove herself ignorant, give Margaret ammunition. Eleanor thought fast. She could not discuss politics she knew nothing about, but she could talk about what she did know. I'm not qualified to discuss territorial policy, Mr. Cole, but I can tell you about land management. When you cut timber too fast, you destroy the watershed. Springs turn muddy, soil washes away. What looks like profit today becomes devastation tomorrow. Smart expansion means thinking about what you're leaving behind, not just what you're taking right now. Cole's eyebrows rose. You're talking about sustainable practices. I'm talking about not being stupid. Eleanor met his eyes directly. My father's mind went dry because the company upstream clear-cut the hillside, changed the water table, destroyed the aquifer. They made their money and moved on. My father went bankrupt. That's expansion without wisdom, and it destroys more than it builds. Silence spread outward from their conversation. Other people had stopped to listen. Cole looked at Eleanor with new assessment in his eyes. That's an interesting perspective, Mrs. Bridger. Quite interesting indeed. Governor Harrison himself approached a tall man with a politician's smile and shrewd eyes. What's this about sustainable practices that sounds like a conversation I need to join? And suddenly Eleanor found herself in the center of a group of powerful men discussing watershed management and forestry practices in long-term planning. They listened. They asked questions. They treated her like someone worth hearing. Across the room, Margaret watched with ice forming in her eyes. The trap was about to spring. Margaret struck an hour later when the crowd had grown thick and the music loud. She appeared with Cole and Pritchard flanking her like legal enforcers, her face composed in perfect society calm that promised violence underneath. Mrs. Bridger, Margaret's voice carried across nearby conversations, drawing attention like blood in water. We've all been so curious about your background, your family. Surely you understand that marrying into Bridger Timber means accepting certain responsibilities. Eleanor felt the trap closing, but could not see how to avoid it. I understand I married Samuel. The rest is details. Oh, but details matter so much. Margaret smiled her shark smile. For instance, Bridger Timber is negotiating contracts that will shape the territory's future. We need stability, leadership, someone who can represent the company in Denver society and convince investors we're sound. I'm not here to convince anyone of anything. No. Margaret's voice sharpened. Then why are you here, Mrs. Bridger? Certainly not because you're qualified to be the wife of a major company's owner. You have no education in business, no social connections, no understanding of how these things work. The crowd was gathering now, sensing drama. Eleanor saw Samuel pushing through the press of bodies, but he was too far away to reach her in time. What I have, Eleanor said carefully, is the same thing your brother Robert had when he started Bridger Timber. The willingness to work hard, think clearly, and build something that lasts. Robert Bridger was a visionary businessman. You're a miner's daughter who married up out of desperation. Margaret's words fell like hammers. In this company, this legacy my brother built deserves better than someone who was purchased to fill an empty house. The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. Purchased. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? Samuel had bought her with his money and her father's desperation. Everything else was just decoration on that fundamental transaction. Eleanor felt her throat close, felt the weight of every eye in the ballroom judging her and finding her wanting. She had come here thinking strength would be enough, but strength could not change where she came from or how she had arrived at Winter Ridge. Margaret sensed victory, pressed harder. The board has reviewed your marriage, Mrs. Bridger. We find it endangers company stability. Mr. Pritchard has the documentation. The lawyer stepped forward, opened his case, pulled out papers that looked official and damning. Under the terms of Robert Bridger's will, any marriage that creates reputational or financial risk can be challenged by board vote. We've compiled testimony from investors expressing concern. Combined with Mrs. Bridger's lack of appropriate background, we believe we have grounds for annulment. The room had gone silent. Even the musicians had stopped playing. This was not business anymore. It was execution. Eleanor looked for Samuel, found him trapped in a knot of people, his face desperate. She was alone, the way she had always been alone when it mattered most. But then she remembered. Something Samuel had taught her during their preparation sessions. Something about Robert Bridger's will that had seemed unimportant at the time. May I see the document? Eleanor kept her voice steady despite the fear eating at her insides. Pritchard looked surprised but handed over the will. Eleanor read it slowly, her finger following the cramped legal text. Mrs. Cooper had made her practice reading formal documents during their training. Eleanor had thought it pointless. Now it might save her life. There, hidden in the middle of a paragraph about company control and family stability. A clause that specified grounds for challenging a marriage, unless said union demonstrably serves the public good and territorial interests. Eleanor looked up, found Governor Harrison watching from the edge of the crowd with curiosity in his eyes. Governor Harrison, Eleanor said, clearly projecting her voice the way she had learned to call Will and Grace across the mining camp. May I ask you a question? The governor stepped forward, intrigued. Of course, Mrs. Bridger. You mentioned earlier that the territory needs better land management practices. That clear cutting is destroying watersheds and costing communities their water supply. I did. It's a serious problem. Would you say that someone with practical knowledge of those issues, someone who had seen the damage firsthand and could advise on sustainable practices, would that serve the territorial public good? Harrison's eyes narrowed, but not with suspicion, with understanding. It certainly would. We're desperate for people who understand both the business side and the practical realities. Eleanor turned to face Margaret and the lawyer. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice stayed steady. This document says a marriage can be challenged unless it serves the public good. I'm offering to serve as an advisor on high country resource management. No pay, just my knowledge and experience. Would that qualify as serving the public good, Governor? The ballroom held its breath. Governor Harrison looked from Eleanor to Margaret to the legal document. A smile played at the corner of his mouth. Mrs. Bridger, I would be honored if you would accept an appointment as informal advisor to my office on matters of land use and forestry in the high country. Your insights this evening have been invaluable. He snapped his fingers. An aide appeared with paper and pen. The governor wrote a brief note, stamped it with his seal, signed it with a flourish. There, official. As of this moment, Eleanor Bridger is an advisor to the territorial governor's office. He handed her the document. I believe that satisfies the public good requirement, Mr. Pritchard. The lawyer's mouth worked silently. He looked at the will, then at the governor's letter, then at Margaret. Pritchard cleared his throat. It appears so, yes. The board's challenge is no longer valid. The ballroom erupted. Applause from some quarters. Shocked whispers from others. Margaret stood frozen, her face pale with rage and disbelief. She had sharpened her knife, and Eleanor had turned it in her hand. Samuel broke through the crowd, reached Eleanor's side. His eyes held wonder and relief, and something that might have been the beginning of love. But Eleanor barely noticed. She was looking at Margaret Bridger, seeing the defeat in her eyes and feeling not triumph but exhaustion. She had won, but victory felt like surviving instead of succeeding. The reception continued around them, but Eleanor needed air. She moved toward the terrace doors, Samuel beside her, and stepped out into the cool Denver night. You were magnificent, Samuel said quietly. I was desperate. Eleanor leaned against the rail, looking at the city lights below. That's not the same thing. Still, you found a way through. This time, but Margaret won't forget. And Cole, he's still holding your debt. This isn't over. Samuel was quiet. Then, there's something else you should know, something I learned this week. Eleanor turned to face him. The fear in his voice made her stomach clench. Cole told me where he got your father's debt note. He bought it from the Denver bank 3 months ago, before I ever came to Pine Ridge. Samuel paused. Your father knew Eleanor. He knew I was wealthy before I ever knocked on his door. The rumors had reached Pine Ridge. He encouraged the marriage knowing who I really was. The words hit Eleanor like cold water. Her father had known, had sold her anyway, had let her believe she was making a sacrifice when really he was making a transaction. Are you sure Cole has letters, documentation? Your father wrote to the bank asking about my finances. He knew exactly who Sam Bridger was. Eleanor gripped the terrace rail until her knuckles went white. Everything she had believed about that night in the cabin about her father's shame and desperation was built on lies. Not Samuel's lies this time, her father's. I'm sorry, Samuel said. I know how much that must hurt. Eleanor laughed, but the sound was broken. We're quite a pair, aren't we? You lied about being poor. My father lied about not knowing you were rich, and I'm the fool caught in the middle thinking any of it was honest. Samuel reached for her hand. She let him take it, let him hold it like an anchor in the storm that was tearing through her chest. What do we do now? Eleanor asked. We go home, to Winter Ridge, and we try to build something true, out of all these lies. But Eleanor was thinking about Cole and the debt and Margaret's rage, about the victory they had won tonight that had cost more than she knew how to measure. They had survived the ballroom test, but the real trials she suspected were just beginning. And somewhere in Denver, Margaret Bridger was already planning her revenge. The coach rolled through the foothills in silence, heavy as stone. Eleanor sat beside Samuel, watching mountains rise to meet them, her mind turning over the same bitter truth again and again. Her father had known, had sold her with his eyes wide open. Everything she believed about that night, about sacrifice and desperation and impossible choices, was built on a foundation of lies. Samuel said nothing. Let her sit with it. Sometimes silence was the only honest thing left between two people who had both been lied to and done lying in return. Winter Ridge appeared through the trees like a promise kept. The valley spread below them, green and whole, the lodge standing solid in the afternoon light. Workers moved through the yard. Smoke rose from the mill, life continuing as it always had, indifferent to the small dramas of the humans who thought they controlled it. Mrs. Cooper met them at the door, relief plain on her face. Thank God you're back safe. We heard, well, rumors travel fast. They're saying you faced down Margaret Bridger herself. Something like that. Eleanor moved past her into the great room. The space felt different now, not like a cage anymore, more like armor. This house, this valley, this strange life she had fallen into. It was hers now. She had bled for it. Samuel caught up with her at the base of the stairs. What do you need to visit my father alone tomorrow? Eleanor. Alone, Samuel. This is between him and me. Samuel nodded slowly, respected her enough not to argue. That was new. That was something. That night, Eleanor lay awake in the grand bedroom that still felt like it belonged to someone else. Anna's ghost hung in the corners, the first wife who could not survive these mountains. Eleanor wondered if she would do any better, if survival was even the right word for what she was doing. Morning came cold and clear. Samuel had a horse saddled and provisions packed before dawn. He handed Eleanor an envelope thick with bills. For your family, extra beyond what I promised. Your father's lungs are worse. Will needs tools for the claim. Grace deserves a real school. Eleanor took the money without thanking him. Gratitude felt like lies right now, and she was done with lies. The ride to Pine Ridge took most of the day. The town looked smaller than Eleanor remembered. Dirtier, more desperate. Had it always been this way, or had her eyes changed? The Hayes cabin sat quiet in the afternoon light. Smoke struggled from the chimney. In the yard, Will worked the garden muscles harder than they had been 2 months ago. He looked up when Eleanor rode in, and his face split with genuine joy. Ellie, he ran to help her down. We heard stories. Is it true you're really living at Winter Ridge in the big house? It's true. Eleanor hugged him hard. How's Pa? Will's face clouded. Not good. The cough's worse. But the money Bridger sent, it's helped. We've got medicine now. Real medicine. Inside the cabin smelled of sickness and soup. Grace sat by the stove doing schoolwork from books Eleanor had sent. She squealed and threw herself at her sister. Eleanor held her close, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and childhood innocence. Thomas sat in his chair by the cold fireplace, wrapped in the new blankets Samuel had provided. He looked smaller than Eleanor remembered, frailer, death sitting patient on his shoulder. Eleanor. His voice was rough as gravel. You look different. Fine. I need to talk to you, Pa. Alone. Will and Grace exchanged glances but took the hint, went outside to give them space. When the door closed, Eleanor pulled a chair close and sat where she could see her father's eyes. You knew, she said without preamble. You knew Samuel Bridger was wealthy before he came to our door. Thomas's face went pale. His hands gripped the chair arms hard enough to make the wood creak. Who told you that? Does it matter? Is it true? Silence, long and damning. Then Thomas looked away and Eleanor had her answer. How long had you known? 3 months. The words came out broken, ashamed. Rumors came through the trading post. Rich man working incognito in the camps trying to find, I don't know what he was looking for. But when he showed up at our door, I knew who he really was. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. Not anger, something colder. You let me think I was making a sacrifice. You let me believe I was saving the family through my own choice. You were saving the family. No, you were selling me. There's a difference, Pa, and you know it. Thomas's breath caught, turned into a cough that bent him double. When he straightened, there was blood on his handkerchief. I was desperate. The debt was crushing us. I saw a chance and I took it. You took my choice away. You still chose to marry him. Based on lies. Eleanor's voice cracked. You taught me that honesty matters, that a man's word is his worth. Where was your honesty that night? Where was your word? Thomas wiped his mouth with shaking hands. I'm dying, Eleanor. Probably won't see spring. I did what I thought was right to make sure Will and Grace would be taken care of after I'm gone. Was it wrong, maybe? But I'd do it again if it meant my children survived. Eleanor looked at this man who had raised her after her mother died, who had done his best with limited tools and bad luck, who had loved her in his broken way and still found room to betray her when survival demanded it. I forgive you, she said finally, because I love you and because I understand desperation better than I want to. But I won't forget Pa, and I won't lie to you in return. Samuel's money bought this cabin, those supplies, Will and Grace's future. You owe him the truth. No more rumors, no more schemes, just honesty for however much time you have left. Thomas nodded, tears tracking down his weathered face. I'm sorry, girl, for all of it. I know. Eleanor stood, kissed his forehead the way she used to when she was small, and thought her father could fix anything. I'll send more money, more medicine, but I need you to understand something. Winter Ridge is my home now, not because I was bought, but because I chose it. There's a difference. She said goodbye to Will and Grace with promises to visit again soon. Rode back toward the mountains as the sun set behind her, painting the world in shades of regret and acceptance. When she arrived at Winter Ridge, after dark, Samuel was waiting on the porch. He took one look at her face and poured whiskey into 2 glasses. They sat together in the quiet, drinking and watching stars emerge. Did you say what you needed to say? Samuel asked. Yes. Do you feel better? No, but I feel honest, and that's worth more. Samuel reached for her hand. Eleanor let him take it. They sat that way for a long time, 2 people who had lied and been lied to, trying to build something true from the wreckage. 3 days later, the revenge began. Eleanor woke to shouting and the smell of smoke. She threw on a robe and ran to the window. In the valley below, orange flames licked at the sky. The sawmill was burning. Samuel was already dressed, pulling on boots. Stay here. Like hell. Eleanor grabbed clothes, dressed faster than she ever had, and followed him down the stairs. By the time they reached the mill, 20 men were fighting the fire with buckets from the river. The flames had taken the main building, but had not yet spread to the lumber stacks. If those caught, they would lose months of work and thousands of dollars. Samuel directed the effort with calm efficiency, shouting orders, organizing bucket lines, working alongside his men to beat back the flames. Eleanor found herself in the chain passing buckets until her shoulders screamed and her hands blistered. Dawn came gray with smoke. The mill building was gone, collapsed into charcoal and ruin. But the lumber was saved and no one was hurt. Small mercies. The foreman, a solid man named Jackson with 30 years in timber, examined the wreckage with grim expertise. This wasn't an accident, boss. Fire started in 3 places at once. And look, he pointed to marks on the ground. Accelerant, kerosene maybe. Someone wanted this mill gone. Samuel's face went hard as granite. Send for the sheriff. The sheriff arrived that afternoon, a weathered man named Morris, who had seen enough crime in mining camps to recognize it anywhere. He examined the evidence, took statements, and delivered his verdict with regretful certainty. Arson, no question. Professional job, too. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. He looked at Samuel. You got enemies, Bridger. Samuel's jaw worked. Yes. The kind who'd burned down a mill, apparently. Morris made notes in a small book. I'll ask around, but I'll be honest with you. If they were smart enough to use accelerant, they're smart enough to cover their tracks. Unless someone talks, we probably won't find them. 3 days later, the northern timber stands burned. Eleanor saw the smoke from the house. Black columns rising into clean sky, visible for miles. Samuel was in Denver meeting with suppliers. Eleanor rode out with Jackson and a dozen men to fight it. The fire had started in 2 of their best stands, old growth that Samuel had been carefully managing for years. Flames climbed the ancient trees like demons, consuming centuries in minutes. They fought until their lungs filled with smoke and their faces blistered from heat, saved maybe half of what was burning. When Samuel returned that night, Eleanor met him on the porch with whiskey and bad news. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat down like his legs could not hold him anymore. $15,000, he said quietly. Maybe more. Between the mill and the timber, we've lost $15,000 in a week. Eleanor felt cold despite the summer heat. Can we recover? Not quickly enough. Cole is demanding payment on his loan. Margaret arranged it. He wants the full amount in 30 days or he starts seizure proceedings. Can you raise it? Samuel looked at his hands, calloused from work but clean because he had the luxury of washing. Not without selling off equipment or timber rights, which would cripple the operation. Or, he stopped. Or what? The board has an emergency meeting scheduled in Denver next week. They're going to propose a solution. The way he said solution made Eleanor's stomach turn. What kind of solution? The kind that saves the company but costs everything that matters. They traveled to Denver again 3 days later. This time there was no preparation, no pretty dress, no rehearsal. This was not a social battle. This was business cold and final as winter. The board meeting took place in a room that smelled of cigar smoke and old money. Margaret sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne. Cole and Pritchard flanked her. 3 other board members filled out the circle. Men Eleanor did not know, but who held Samuel's future in their votes. Samuel had brought Eleanor despite Margaret's objection. She's an advisor to the governor. She has a right to understand company business. Margaret's smile could have cut glass. Of course. Let Mrs. Bridger see how real decisions are made. Cole opened the meeting with numbers, dry recitation of losses and liabilities and cash flow problems that boiled down to one simple truth. Bridger Timber was on the edge of bankruptcy unless something drastic happened soon. We have a solution, Cole said, pulling out a map of Winter Ridge. He pointed to the northern ridge. This stand of old-growth timber, 300-year-old trees, prime lumber. The railroad is offering $50,000 for exclusive cutting rights, more than enough to pay all debts and restore operating capital. Samuel's face had gone pale. That stand protects the watershed. Cut it and you destroy the aquifer. The valley dies. The valley dies faster if we go bankrupt. Margaret's voice was ice. This is business, Samuel. Sentiment is a luxury we can no longer afford. My father spent 30 years protecting that stand. He knew it was the key to sustainable operation. Your father is dead. Margaret's words fell like hammers, and his idealism died with him. The modern timber business requires making hard choices. This is one of them. Pritchard laid out papers. The railroad needs an answer within 48 hours. They have other suppliers. If we refuse, they go elsewhere and we lose everything. Samuel looked at Eleanor. She saw the question in his eyes, the desperate hope that she might have a miracle hidden somewhere. But Eleanor had no miracles, only the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had kept her family alive in Pine Ridge. Give me 48 hours, Eleanor said. Margaret laughed, actually laughed. And what exactly will you do in 48 hours, Mrs. Bridger, find investors who care about sentiment more than profit? Maybe, Eleanor stood, looked directly at Margaret. Or maybe I'll find a way to save the company without destroying its soul. That's what Samuel's father would have wanted, and that's what I'm going to try to give it to him. She walked out before Margaret could respond. Samuel followed. In the hallway, he caught her arm. Eleanor, what are you planning? I don't know yet, but there has to be another way. There has to be. They spent that evening in their hotel room with paper and pencils and increasingly desperate calculations. Samuel walked her through every asset the company owned. The mill, the equipment, the timber rights, the worker housing. Winter House itself, Eleanor stopped. Say that again. The worker housing. After that. Winter House, Samuel's brow furrowed. What about it? Eleanor looked at the numbers, at the crushing weight of debt and the impossible choice between bankruptcy and betrayal. And an idea formed, reckless, probably stupid, but the only thing she could think of that might work. What if we don't cut the old growth, she said slowly. What if we sell something else instead? We don't have anything else worth $50,000. Yes, we do. Eleanor met his eyes. We have Winter House. The words hung in the air between them. Samuel stared at her like she had suggested burning down the world. That house has been in my family for 30 years. My father built it for my mother. It's our home. It's a building. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. The valley is home. The timber is home. The work is home. That house is just walls and windows. Beautiful walls, but still just a building. You're asking me to give up everything my father built. I'm asking you to save everything your father believed in. Eleanor took his hands. The old growth protects the watershed. You said it yourself. Cut it and the valley dies. Your father knew that. He built this company on sustainable practices, on thinking generations ahead, selling one building to preserve that legacy. Isn't that what he would have wanted? Samuel pulled away, paced to the window, stood there looking out at Denver lights and breathing hard like a man who had been gut-punched. Where would we live? In a cabin, like we should have been living all along. Something honest, something built by our own hands instead of inherited privilege. What if we sell and still fail? Then we fail with our principles intact. Eleanor came to stand beside him. But I don't think we'll fail. I think we'll survive. And 50 years from now, your grandchildren will stand on that ridge and see forest instead of mud, because you chose the hard right over the easy wrong. Samuel closed his eyes. When he opened them, they held tears he was too proud to let fall. I hate that you're right. I know. If we do this, there's no going back. I know that too. Samuel took a shuddering breath. All right, find a buyer. You have 36 hours. Eleanor started with the one person in Denver she thought might actually help. Sarah Harrison, the governor's wife. She showed up at the governor's mansion at 8 in the morning without an appointment and refused to leave until Sarah would see her. When Sarah finally appeared curious and concerned, Eleanor explained the situation in blunt terms. The fire, the debt, the impossible choice, and the desperate gamble she was proposing. Sarah listened, her face growing more thoughtful with each word. When Eleanor finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. That's a bold plan, Mrs. Bridger. Possibly insane, but bold. She tapped her fingers on the arm of her chair. My husband has a friend, Charles Weston, railroad magnate. He's been talking about wanting a mountain retreat, somewhere away from business pressures. Beautiful location, good hunting and fishing. Would he be interested in Winter House? Possibly, but there's something you should know about Charles. He's a businessman first and last. He'll want value for his money, and he'll want assurances. What kind of assurances? Sarah smiled. That the property will retain its value, that the timber operation will continue sustainably, that he's not buying into a company about to collapse. She stood. Come with me. Let's go talk to my husband. Governor Harrison listened to Eleanor's proposal with the careful attention of a man used to weighing impossible choices. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied her. You're asking me to broker a private sale between my friend and your husband's company. I'm asking you to help save a valley and 65 working families. That's skillful political framing, Mrs. Bridger. It's also true, Harrison smiled despite himself. Sarah's right, you are bold. He pulled out paper and pen. I'll write to Charles, but he's in San Francisco right now. It'll take a day to reach him by telegram, another day for him to travel here if he's interested, and he'll want to see the property before committing to anything. We have 36 hours. Then we'd better work fast. The telegram went out at noon. Charles Weston's reply came back at 4. Interested. Arriving tomorrow morning. Send details. Eleanor and Samuel spent that evening writing descriptions of Winter House, listing every feature and amenity, explaining the property's value and potential. They sent it all by evening telegram and then sat up through the night, waiting, too nervous to sleep. Charles Weston arrived at their hotel at 9 the next morning. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair and the lean build of a man who worked as hard as he expected others to work. His eyes were shrewd and calculating, but not unkind. Governor Harrison speaks highly of you both, Weston said without preamble. Says you're trying to save timber operations while protecting the land. That's rare in this business. Most companies cut everything and move on. Samuel explained the situation honestly. The fires, the debt, the choice between clear-cutting old growth or selling Winter House. Weston listened without interrupting, his face revealing nothing. "I'd need to see the property," Weston said finally. "We can ride out today. Be there by evening." "No need. I'll take the morning train to the foothills and ride from there. Have horses ready." Weston stood. "And Mr. Bridger, I'm interested, but only if this isn't a desperate fire sale. I want a property I can use for 20 years, not one I'll have to sell in 5 because the valley died." "The valley won't die," Samuel said. "That's the whole point." Weston nodded. "Then let's go see if your house is worth saving your forest." They rode up to Winter Ridge that afternoon, all three of them, plus Governor Harrison, who had insisted on coming. Weston examined everything: the house, the valley, the mill ruins, the timber stands. He asked hard questions about water rights and timber access and long-term sustainability. At the ridge overlooking the old-growth forest, Weston stood for a long time just looking at the trees. "My grandfather was a logger in Maine," he said quietly. "Clear-cut thousands of acres. Made a fortune. By the time he died, that land was worthless. Took 3 generations to recover if it ever did." He turned to face Samuel. "I've spent my life building roads, moving forward, never stopping to think about what gets left behind. Maybe it's time I built something that lasted." "So you're interested," Eleanor barely dared to hope. "I'm more than interested. I'll pay $40,000 for the house and 200 acres surrounding it. You keep the timber rights on my land. I keep the house and privacy. We put a conservation clause in the contract that protects that old growth in perpetuity." Samuel's breath caught. 40,000? It's worth it to me. And before you ask, yes, I can have the money by tomorrow afternoon. I keep significant capital liquid for opportunities exactly like this. They finalized terms that evening in Winterhouse's great room. Lawyers summoned from Denver to draft documents, papers signed by lamplight, money transferred by telegraph to waiting banks. At midnight, Samuel Bridger no longer owned the house his father had built, but he owned his principles, and that Eleanor thought was worth more than any building ever could be. Yeah. The emergency board meeting reconvened the next morning with the same players but a different script. Samuel laid papers on the table in front of Margaret and Cole and the others. Deed of sale, bank transfer receipts, $40,000 in cleared funds. "All debts are paid," Samuel said flatly. "Cole, your note is satisfied in full. Margaret, the arson damage is covered. The company remains solvent and independent. Meeting adjourned." Margaret's face had gone white as bone. "You sold Winter House." "I sold a building to save a forest. My father would have approved." "Your father spent 30 years building that house." "He spent 30 years building a sustainable timber company. The house was just where he slept." Samuel gathered the papers. "The old growth stands untouched. Our workers keep their jobs. We maintain our principles. That's what matters." Cole shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. "Mr. Bridger, while I appreciate your creativity, the board still has concerns about long-term viability. Selling assets to cover emergency losses isn't a sustainable business model." "You're right." Samuel pulled out another document. "Which is why I've prepared a 5-year plan for expanding selective harvest operations while increasing our sustainable certification. Governor Harrison has agreed to promote certified sustainable lumber to railroad contractors. We'll make less per board foot, but gain exclusive contracts that guarantee steady income." He slid the plan across the table. Cole picked it up, read through it with growing interest, looked up with respect in his eyes. "This is actually brilliant. Long-term thinking. Building brand value through responsible practices." He glanced at Margaret. "This changes things." "It changes nothing." Margaret stood, her control finally cracking. "He sold his family home rather than make hard business choices. He's weak, sentimental. Exactly the kind of leadership that will destroy this company. Or save it." Eleanor spoke for the first time. Every head turned toward her. "You all want to talk about strength. Let me tell you about strength. Strength is not cutting everything in sight for quick profit. Strength is thinking about your children's children before you think about next quarter's dividends." She pulled out papers of her own, charts and projections she had worked on for 2 days with Samuel. This shows timber yields over 50 years. Clear-cut the old growth, and in 20 years you have nothing left. No trees to harvest. No watershed to protect the new growth. No company at all. Selective harvest with sustainable practices, and in 50 years you're still cutting timber. Still employing workers. Still generating profit, which is the stronger choice. Silence around the table. Men looking at numbers that told an uncomfortable truth. My husband didn't choose trees over profits, Eleanor continued. He chose sustainable profits over quick wealth. He chose his father's legacy over your impatience. And if you can't see that as strength, then you don't understand what strength actually means. Cole cleared his throat. Mrs. Bridger makes a compelling point. She makes a naive point, Margaret snapped. This is business, not a philosophy seminar. Business is philosophy, Samuel said quietly. The philosophy of what kind of men we want to be, what kind of legacy we leave. My father understood that. Eleanor understands that. The question is, does this board? Pritchard adjusted his spectacles. I move we vote. All those in favor of accepting Mr. Bridger's 5-year plan and closing this emergency review. Hands went up slowly, Cole first, then Pritchard, then 3 others. 7 votes in favor. Margaret sat frozen, her face a mask of rage and defeat. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Samuel met her eyes. You tried to force me to destroy what my father built. Instead, I found a way to preserve it. That's the difference between us, Aunt Margaret. You see obstacles. I see opportunities. And Eleanor sees truth. We'll survive this. You're welcome to join us or not. Your choice, darling. Margaret gathered her papers with shaking hands, walked out without another word. They would later learn she left Denver that same day, returned east, died alone in 1889 with her fortune intact and her bitterness undiminished. But that day and that moment, she was simply defeated. And Samuel Bridger had won not through force but through principle, through choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, through having a partner who was strong enough to demand he be better than his fear. They moved into a small cabin on the western edge of the valley 2 weeks later. 2 rooms, wood stove, windows that looked out on timber stands instead of formal gardens. It was smaller than the Hayes cabin in Pine Ridge, but it was theirs, earned, chosen. Samuel built most of it himself, working alongside his crew. Eleanor planted a garden. They cooked simple meals and ate at a plain table and discovered that happiness had less to do with luxury than they had been taught to believe. Winter House stood across the valley lights burning in its windows, where Charles Weston and his family spent summers and holidays. Good neighbors, respectful of the land, true to their contract. 5 years passed, the company prospered. Eleanor's appointment as territorial advisor became formal and paid. She traveled to other operations, teaching sustainable practices, helping write regulations that protected workers and forests alike. Samuel aged into the role his father had built for him, not as heir to privilege, but as steward of something larger than himself. Their first child was born in 1890, Robert named for his grandfather. Then Anna in 1892, named without irony for the first wife who could not survive these mountains. And Michael in 1895, who would one day take over the mill operations and run them for 40 years. Thomas Hayes died peacefully in 1808, his lungs finally giving up the fight. Will took over the Pine Ridge claim, found a thin vein of silver, made a modest living. Grace married a teacher and raised 4 children in a house with more books than furniture. The Hayes family survived because Eleanor had been strong enough to do what was necessary, and Samuel had been wealthy enough to make it possible. By 1905, Winter Ridge was thriving. The old growth stood untouched, protected now by territorial law that Governor Harrison had helped pass. The sustainable practices Samuel had fought for became industry standard. Other companies copied their model or went bankrupt trying to fight it. Eleanor at 43 was something rare in the territory, a woman with genuine power. Not social power or inherited wealth, but the authority that came from knowing things others needed to know. She taught at the expanded school, advised the governor on land use policy, wrote articles for forestry journals about watershed management and long-term thinking. Samuel at 53 was silver-haired and respected, no longer the lonely rich man pretending to be poor, but a leader who had proven that principle and profit could coexist if you were willing to work hard and think clearly. Margaret's death in 1889 had been noted but not mourned. She left nothing to Samuel. The final petty gesture of a woman who never learned that love could not be bought or forced. The Depression came in 1929 like a slow-moving avalanche. Banks failed. Companies collapsed. Timber markets crashed as construction stopped nationwide. Eleanor at 67 and Samuel at 77 watched other operations fail around them. Companies that had clear-cut their forests decades earlier had nothing left to harvest. They went bankrupt or sold for pennies while their owners struggled to understand what went wrong. Winter Ridge survived because Samuel had chosen sustainability 50 years earlier, because Eleanor had demanded they think about grandchildren instead of quarterly profits. The old growth stood untouched, and the selectively harvested stands had regenerated into valuable timber, just as Samuel's father had promised they would. Their grandson Marcus was born in 1925. Robert's son, a serious child who loved the woods and asked hard questions. Samuel took him into the timber stands as soon as he could walk, taught him about growth rings and watershed dynamics and thinking in generations instead of years. By 1935, as the Depression dragged on and Eleanor turned 73, Marcus was 10 years old and already asking the questions that mattered. Why did other companies fail when Winter Ridge survived? Why did some men think only about today when tomorrow always came? Because fear makes people stupid, Samuel told him. Fear of poverty, fear of failure, fear of being alone. Smart people think past their fear to what's actually true. Your grandmother taught me that. Marcus absorbed this like gospel, watched his grandfather's weathered hands and his grandmother's sharp eyes, and learned that strength was not about never being afraid. It was about being afraid and choosing truth anyway. September 1940. Samuel Bridger sat on the porch of the small cabin he shared with Eleanor, watching his grandson digest the story he had just finished telling. The sun was setting over Winter Ridge, painting the valley in gold and shadow. 55 years had passed since that first desperate ride into the mountains. 55 years of choices and consequences and learning to live with both. Marcus sat forward, elbows on his knees, the draft notice forgotten for the moment. So you lied to Grandma to find out if she was real? I did. And she married you even though she knew something was wrong. She did. And then you nearly lost everything because you chose trees over money. Samuel smiled. We chose the future over the present. There's a difference. Grandma said you had 3 secrets. What was the third one? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, remembering. The third secret was that I loved her from the first moment I saw her fight with that trading post owner about flour weight. Everything else, all the manipulation and testing and desperate stupidity, was just me being too afraid to admit I'd already made my choice. I didn't need to test her. I needed to trust myself. Did you ever tell her that? Eventually, took me about 10 years to figure it out myself. Samuel looked at Marcus directly. You want to know what I learned? What 55 years with your grandmother taught me? Yes, sir. Truth isn't where you start. It's what you build together. Your grandmother and I, we started with lies on both sides. My lies about being poor. Her father's lies about not knowing who I was. My aunt's lies about what the company needed. But we built something true anyway. Because after all the lies were stripped away, we committed to being honest going forward. That's what matters. Not how you start, but what you do after you realize you started wrong. Eleanor came out onto the porch, moving slowly but still strong, still carrying herself like a woman who had fought battles and won. She set down a fresh pot of coffee and 3 cups. Sat beside Samuel with the ease of long practice. Did you tell him about Anna? Eleanor asked. Yes. About my father. Yes. About me facing down Margaret in that ballroom. That too. Eleanor looked at Marcus with those green eyes that age had not dimmed. Your grandfather is being modest. He makes it sound like I was brave. But I was terrified every second. The difference is I did it anyway. Why? Marcus asked. Because something mattered more than fear. Your grandfather's work mattered. Those 65 families mattered. The valley mattered. Sometimes you have to be afraid and do the right thing anyway. That's not courage. That's just refusing to let fear make your choices for you. Marcus picked up the draft notice, turned it over in his hands. Is that what I should do? Go to war because it's the right thing, even though I'm afraid? Samuel and Eleanor exchanged glances. The silent communication of two people who had been married longer than Marcus had been alive. "I can't tell you what to do," Samuel said. "Only you know what's right for you. But I can tell you this. When I was young, I ran from fear by lying, by trying to control everything, by testing people instead of trusting them, and it nearly destroyed me. Your grandmother," Eleanor added, "faced her fear by walking into it with her eyes open, by accepting hard choices and making them anyway, by refusing to be broken by circumstances she didn't choose." "Which way is right?" Marcus asked. "Both, neither." Samuel shrugged. "What matters is that you choose consciously. Don't let fear choose for you. Don't let other people's expectations choose for you. Look at what's true and what matters and make your choice from there. And if I make the wrong choice, then you'll learn and you'll choose better next time." Eleanor smiled. "That's all any of us can do, Marcus. Make the best choice we can with what we know and then live with it honestly." Marcus stood, looked out at the valley that had shaped 3 generations of his family. The mill by the river still turning, the worker cabins with lights beginning to glow in windows, the old growth forest on the North Ridge, untouched for 55 years, standing as testament to choices made before he was born. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. "Thank you for telling me." He walked down the steps toward the mill where his father waited to take him home. Samuel and Eleanor watched him go, 2 old people who had traveled impossible distances to arrive exactly where they needed to be. "Do you think he'll enlist?" Eleanor asked. "I don't know, but I think he'll choose consciously. That's all we can ask." They sat together as twilight deepened into night. The valley below them was quiet except for the eternal sound of the river and the wind in the pines. Winter House stood in the distance, lights warm in Charles Weston's windows. The old growth forest was a dark presence on the ridge holding its ancient secrets. Samuel reached for Eleanor's hand, found it waiting for his, held it the way he had held it for 55 years through lies and truth and all the complicated country between. "I never thanked you," he said. "For what?" "For saving me. From myself, from my fear, from dying rich and miserable and alone." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "You saved me too. From poverty, from desperation, from being small when I was meant to be large. We saved each other then." "I suppose we did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Behind them, the small cabin they had built together waited. Ahead, whatever time they had left. But in this moment, they had exactly what they needed. Each other, the valley, the truth they had built from lies. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "Giving up Winter House, the wealth, the easy life you could have had?" Samuel thought about it. Really thought. Then shook his head. "No, I don't miss the house. I don't miss the pretending. I don't miss the loneliness of being rich and empty. What I have now, what we built together, it's worth more than anything I gave up. Even when we were fighting, when I hated you for lying. Especially then, because you cared enough to be angry, to demand better, to refuse to settle for comfortable lies." Samuel looked at his wife, this woman who had been bought with money and had chosen to stay for reasons that had nothing to do with gold. "You taught me something, Eleanor. You taught me that love isn't what you feel. It's what you choose. Every day, despite the fear, despite the difficulty, you choose truth over comfort, partnership over control. That's love." Eleanor's eyes glistened in the starlight. "You're getting sentimental in your old age." "I'm getting honest. There's a difference." She laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet valley. "Yes, yes there is." They stood together, joints creaking with age but hearts still strong. Walked back into their small cabin where dinner waited and evening chores needed doing. The rhythm of ordinary life that was more precious than any mansion, any fortune, and any social triumph in a Denver ballroom. The valley held its secrets as valleys do. The old growth stood untouched. The river ran clear and cold, and 2 people who had started with lies had built something true enough to last generations. That was legacy. That was wealth. That was what mattered when everything else was stripped away. In the morning, Marcus would make his choice about the draft notice. About war and duty and fear and courage. And whatever he chose, he would carry with him the story his grandfather had told. The story of a man who lied to find truth and a woman who was bought but chose to stay. The story of Winter Ridge and everything it meant to choose principle over comfort, truth over fear, partnership over loneliness. The valley would remember, the forest would stand, and the choices made 55 years ago would echo forward into futures Samuel and Eleanor would never see, but had helped shape with every hard decision, every honest word, every moment they chose truth, when lies would have been easier. That was the real secret, not the three secrets Samuel had mentioned to Marcus, but the fourth one, the one he and Eleanor had discovered together through decades of work and compromise and choosing each other every morning. The secret was that nothing worth having came easy. That real love was built from choice and commitment and refusing to quit when quitting would be simpler. That legacy was not what you inherited, but what you left behind. That truth, no matter how painful, was always stronger than the most comfortable lie. And that sometimes when you were very lucky, you found someone who saw past your money or your poverty to the actual human underneath. Someone who demanded honesty even when it hurt. Someone who stood beside you when the world tried to tear you apart. Someone who made you want to be better than your fear. Samuel Bridger had been that lucky, and he knew it. And that knowledge, more than anything else, was what let him sit on his porch at 88 years old and feel genuinely wealthy in the ways that actually mattered. The rest was just details. The story was the truth, and the truth was what would last.